Okay, so you pull out a dollar bill, maybe to grab a coffee or, just stick it back in your wallet. Ever really look at it? That phrase, Federal Reserve note,
Hmm.
it's everywhere, but have you ever stopped and thought, what is the Federal Reserve System? Like, where did this huge, powerful thing actually come from?
And those questions, they lead us right into the source material we're diving into today, shared by a listener. It's a book called Secrets of the Federal Reserve. And it presents, well, a very specific viewpoint.
Yeah, and the story behind the research itself is pretty wild, according to the source. The author says he started back in 1949. He was only 25.
Right, and he was visiting Ezra, the Ezra Pound the poet. Pound was being held as a political prisoner at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, no trial.
Wow.
And the source explains Pound, he'd broadcast from Italy during the war, urging the U.S. to stay out, got indicted under FDR. The source links his assistance to communist espionage, interestingly. Anyway, Pound suspected this international banking group was secretly pulling the strings behind the Federal Reserve.
So Pound couldn't do the research himself, being locked up.
Exactly. So he apparently asks this young author, our source's author, to dig into it at the Library of Congress.
And the author describes it like tackling a detective story. He got help from a scholar. George Stimson calls him our walking library of Congresses.
Nice description.
Yeah. So the mission, as laid out in this book, was to uncover the real story of the Fed's origins, its nature, using just tons of research, hundreds of sources, newspapers, books, charts, you name it.
And the central argument, the big claim in this source material, is pretty explosive. It's that an international banking group, working in secret, basically planned and pushed through the Federal Reserve Act.
Meaning it's not the purely governmental body we might think it is.
That's the core assertion, yeah.
Yeah.
So our task today is to unpack exactly what this source says about how that supposedly happened.
Okay, let's jump right in. Where does the source claim this whole thing began? It sets a pretty dramatic scene, actually. Autumn, 1910. A very exclusive, remote spot, Jekyll Island, Georgia.
Right. The book describes 6 men meeting there, totally secretly. You had Senator Nelson Aldrich,
Big political name.
huge, his secretary, Shelton. Then AP Ed Andrew from the Treasury. Henry P. Davison, a top partner at J.P. Morgan.
Okay, heavy hitters.
Definitely. Frank A. Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York, and Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb Company. I mean, these were giants in banking and politics at the time.
And the secrecy was intense, the source says.
Oh, yeah. Apparently, reporters were sniffing around waiting at the train station in Brunswick. Davison somehow managed to throw them off the scent. Aldrich even asked him later, like, how'd you do that? And this meeting stayed under wraps for years. So much so, the source notes, some people thought it was just, a myth.
But why was this meeting so important, according to the source? What came out of it?
Well, this is key. The source quotes Vanderlip himself, writing years later in his autobiography, saying, their secret expedition to Jekyll Island was the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System.
Wow, conception is a strong word.
It is. And the source really hammers this point.
Yeah.
The core ideas drafted there, which became known as the Aldrich Plan, were essentially all present in the Federal Reserve Act that Congress eventually passed.
So the claim is the blueprint wasn't debated publicly first, but cooked up in private by these bankers and this one influential politician.
That's the narrative presented, yes. 9 days they were supposedly there, working on it.
What was the dynamic like? It must have been tense.
The source paints a picture of, some tension. Aldrich, the only non-banker, is described as sort of domineering, but maybe not having the deep technical know-how. Paul Warburg, the immigrant banker from Germany, apparently lectured them a bit, and the source claims his thick alien accent grated on them. Bit of color there.
Yeah, sounds like it.
And Davison, the Morgan partner, apparently played the diplomat, keeping things together.
And the result was the Aldrich Plan. But the source makes another quite pointed claim about the official body, the National Monetary Commission, right? The one Aldrich chaired.
Exactly. That commission supposedly spent, $300,000 studying European banking systems? But the source alleges it never actually held an official meeting to write the Aldrich Plan itself.
So where did the plan come from then, officially?
According to this source, the only real meeting where the plan was hatched was this secret Jekyll Island conference, a meeting never mentioned in any of the commission's official reports. The source adds that Senator Cummins eventually challenged the commission on its lack of output, and it just sort of faded away. So the implication drawn by the source is that the whole public commission thing was maybe a cover for this privately crafted plan.
Okay, so the source claims secret meeting, secret plan. How does this supposedly get through Congress? Surely there was pushback.
Oh, absolutely. The source makes a point of highlighting the opposition, figures who stood up and questioned it publicly. Most notably, Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh, Sr.
The aviator's father.
That's the one.
What was his main beef with it, according to the source?
The source quotes him pretty directly. He called the Aldrich Plan the Wall Street Plan, said it was backed by a money trust.
Strong language.
Very. He argued it was purely designed to benefit this money trust. He even suggested, the source says, that they might use financial panics, like the one in 1907, to basically scare Congress into passing it.
Wow.
His core point, repeated in the source, was that this plan meant private instead of public control of currency. He saw the whole Monetary Commission as a Wall Street setup.
So not mincing words. Was he alone in this?
No. The source brings up Alfred Crozier, too. A lawyer wrote a book called U.S. Money versus Corporation Currency.
Okay.
Crozier testified against the bill, echoed Lindbergh's concerns, private control, the danger of giving a small group the power to just, make money tight or easy whenever they wanted.
The power to control the economy, basically.
Exactly. The source highlights Crozier quoting President Garfield and Jefferson, warning that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of the people. The source even controversially links this idea to presidential assassinations. Lincoln, Garfield suggesting they challenged private money control.
That's quite a connection to make. Now, besides the public fight, the source alleges there is a lot going on behind the scenes. This is where Colonel Edward Mandell House enters the picture.
Yes, described as this shadowy, non-elected person. Him and Paul Warburg, again, supposedly wielding influence backstage.
And House wrote a book?
Yeah, Philip Drew, administrator, published anonymously. The source presents this book as almost a blueprint for America's future. It supposedly laid out policies aiming for, quote, socialism as dreamed by Karl Marx.
Seriously? Like what?
Things like an income tax, Social Security, and crucially a flexible currency system. A plan, the source claims, was then followed by Presidents Wilson and FDR.
So how does the source connect Colonel House to the bankers pushing the Fed plan?
It claims the big bankers, Schiff, Warburg, Kahn, Rockefeller, Morgan, they all put their trust in House. The source says House's own papers show him talking strategy with Paul Warburg about currency reform and reassuring Warburg that Congress, and crucially, President-elect Wilson, were on board with their plans. The source even mentions cabinet members noticing Wilson seemed to be taking cues directly from House's Philip Drew book.
So you've got this alleged behind-the-scenes operator coordinating with the bankers from Jekyll Island, influencing the incoming president. How did the act itself actually pass?
The source describes the final push as happening with unprecedented speed, right in the week before Christmas, 1913. Usually a quiet time in Congress, breaking tradition.
Suspicious timing.
The source certainly implies that. It quotes the New York Times commenting that Congress worked under public supervision, but the source interprets that cynically. It alleges Paul Warburg actually had an office in the Capitol building during this final push, directing the legislative strategy. Senators and congressmen supposedly coming to him for instructions. The source calls this rushed vote the Christmas massacre.
So putting the source's narrative together, a plan born in secret, opposed publicly as a power grab by financiers, gets rammed through Congress with unusual speed, potentially guided by an unelected advisor coordinating with those same financiers.
That's the picture the source paints of the origin story, yes. And from there, it digs into the structure the act created and brings in this really central controversial idea, the London connection.
Right. The act created 12 regional Fed banks. The public pitch from people like Carter Glass and Senator Owen was that this meant decentralization, absolute democracy, regional control.
But the source flatly calls that a deception. It cites writers like Ferdinand Lundberg, who argued the Federal Reserve Bank of New York very quickly became the real center of power, the fountainhead of the system.
How so?
Controlling the money supply, setting interest rates, running open market operations, basically. The key levers of monetary policy were concentrated in New York, according to this view.
Okay, so New York dominates. But who actually owned the New York Fed? The source addresses this, right? The initial stock.
It does. The source lists the alleged primary owners of the stock bought by the national banks back in 1914. It includes the Rothschilds in Europe, Lozard Frères connected to Eugene Meyer.
We'll hear that name again.
Yep. Kuhn Loeb, which was Paul Warburg's firm, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, the Rockefellers, and J.P. Morgan interests. The source argues these interests became even more concentrated over the years.
And it repeats that claim about how the stock was bought.
Right. The source views the initial purchase by banks as not using existing capital, but as paper issued against paper, essentially creating the funds to buy the stock through accounting entries.
What about the Federal Advisory Council? Bankers advising the main board? How does the source see that?
As another layer reinforcing control, basically. The source claims the council members were typically chosen from banks, already closely tied to those big New York players, the Morgans, the Schiffs, the Warburgs.
How many examples given?
It mentions J.B. Forgan from Chicago's First National Bank, a major correspondent for the New York firms, being the council's first president. The source asks, why would these super busy, powerful bankers travel to D.C. all the time if their advice didn't really matter?
Implying their advice was more like direction.
That's the implication, that the whole structure, despite looking regional, was allegedly designed for central control by these specific private interests.
Which then leads to maybe the most significant claim in this section, that even these powerful U.S. bankers weren't the final authority.
Exactly. The source claims they were answerable to another power, a foreign power. Specifically, the financial cloud of England, centered, it says, in the London branch of the House of Rothschild.
How does it trace that connection?
It goes back historically. Mentions George Peabody, Junie says Morgan, J.P. Morgan's father. It claims the Morgan Bank in New York was always, essentially, directed from London and had this sub rosa relationship, a secret understanding, with the Rothschilds.
So J.P. Morgan as a Rothschild agent in the U.S.
That's the claim. The source also references a supposed British-American secret society, sometimes called the Round Table Group, that allegedly linked London financiers like Rothschilds and Lazard brothers with the Morgan Group in America, providing a channel for coordination.
Okay, so the thesis emerging here is secret U.S. plan, New York banking dominance, ultimate control from London financiers.
That's the core argument of this part of the source, yes. It asserts that ultimate power over world money lies with London merchant bankers, especially the 5 big firms that set the daily gold price, one being N.M. Rothschild.
And these London firms supposedly control the U.S. system.
The source claims they hold sway over the U.S. money system, including the New York Fed. It points to figures like Sir Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, and a partner at Brown Shipley & Co., which was the London arm of Brown Brothers Harriman.
Another name we'll hear again.
Indeed. Norman is portrayed as incredibly influential, even allegedly playing a part in discussions that set the stage for the 1929 crash. So the overall picture is London bankers control New York banks, which control the New York Fed, which, the source claims, controls the whole U.S. system.
That is quite a chain of alleged control. From Jekyll Island, through Congress, the Fed's structure, right across the Atlantic. Let's shift to the alleged consequences the source attributes to this system, starting with something fundamental, how money is created.
Right. The source argues banks, especially the Fed, don't just lend existing money, they create it. Out of thin air, essentially, through bookkeeping. Paper issued against paper is the phrase used.
Can you give the example the source uses?
It uses a simple $1,000 loan example. The source says that $1,000 doesn't actually exist until the bank makes the loan entry in its books, creating the debt and the money simultaneously.
And the source tries to back this up with official testimony.
It does. It quotes Congressman Wright Patman questioning a Fed president directly about this. Patman asks if the Fed creates money on the credit of the nation when it buys government bonds.
And the answer?
The reported answer was, that is correct. The source emphasizes that banks prefer holding this created credit as reserves rather than actual banknotes. It calls this whole process the most incredible part of the system, describes the Federal Reserve notes themselves as irredeemable obligations.
Beyond creating money, the source claims the system was used to cause financial panics.
Yes, deliberately. It alleges that even before the Fed existed, panics like 1907 were engineered by bankers shipping gold overseas to create shortages. Why? To scare Congress into creating a central bank they could control.
And after the Fed was created in 1913?
Then, the source claims, panics could be created more easily through manipulating credit. It points specifically to the agricultural depression of 1920-21 and, of course, the Great Depression starting in 1929.
What's the source's specific claim about that 1920-21 depression?
It alleges it was manufactured. The goal, supposedly, was twofold: break the small rural banks that hadn't joined the said system and ruined farmers who'd done well during World War I.
How?
The source talks about a supposed secret meeting in May 1920 involving the Fed board and big bankers. Allegedly, they decided to sharply raise interest rates and pull back credit, triggering the downturn.
And speaking of major events, World War I financing comes up too.
Directly linked by the source to the Fed's creation. It points out the Fed started operations in 1914, right as the war in Europe kicked off.
Coincidence.
The source argues not. It claims the Fed enabled the U.S. to lend a massive $25 billion to the Allies, money the source says was never paid back, although interest allegedly flowed to New York bankers.
Any specific examples?
It claims J.P. Morgan got the proceeds from the first big war bond drive, the Liberty Loan, to pay off a huge $400 million loan he'd already made to Britain. The source quotes an academic journal praising the Fed for mobilizing finance for the war.
But the source sees it differently.
Critically, yes. It argues the U.S. couldn't have financed the war on that scale without the Fed system in place. It even adds the controversial claim that Colonel Howe secretly negotiated the U.S. entry into the war on the Allied side beforehand.
Okay, this all leads inevitably to the 1929 Great Depression. The source doesn't see this as just an economic accident, does it?
Not at all. This is presented as deliberately planned and executed. A central piece of evidence the source uses is an alleged secret meeting, a luncheon, in 1927.
Who was there?
Federal Reserve governors meeting with the heads of European central banks, Bank of England, the German Reichsbank. The source cites testimony from Fed Governor Adolf Miller confirming the meeting happened, though he apparently downplayed it as mainly social.
But the source claims policy changes resulted.
Big ones. Allegedly, they agreed to ease credit and lower interest rates in the U.S. The effect, according to the source, was gold flowing out of the U.S. to Europe, which stabilized European currencies.
And upset ours.
Exactly. By fueling, the source claims, massive, unsustainable speculation in the U.S. stock market.
So the source claims the Fed deliberately pumped up the bubble.
That's the argument, a calculated buildup. Then the crash itself is described as a calculated shearing of the public by these world money powers.
How was it triggered, according to the source?
Through a planned sudden shortage of the supply of call money. That's the money banks lend brokers for stock speculation.
They just turned off the tap.
The source claims the Fed jacked up the interest rate on call money dramatically. One account cited says it hit 20% overnight. This forced speculators who had borrowed heavily to sell stocks immediately, triggering the massive sell-off.
And the source even claims some people were tipped off.
Yes, it alleges lists existed of insiders who were warned to get out of the market before the crash hit.
There's also a point made about acceptances. How does that fit in?
Right. The source describes a shift happening after the SOC Act, moving away from businesses just having open accounts with each other. Instead, they started using these things called trade acceptances.
What are those basically?
Essentially, they turn a debt owed between businesses into a financial instrument, like a short-term IOU, that banks can then buy, sell, and control. Paul Warburg was apparently a big promoter of this.
And the source sees this as negative.
Yes, it claims this system made it easier for big trusts, backed by banks, to dominate smaller businesses. And it argues this shift contributed to the financial fragility that made the 1929 crash worse by concentrating control over trade finance in the hands of bankers.
Okay, so the source presents a picture of the Fed system being used, allegedly, to manipulate booms and busts, finance wars, all for the benefit of a select group, even down to changing how businesses transact. Did this alleged influence just stop after the Depression?
Not according to the source. It argues the same families, the same interests, maintain their grip. It points to figures like Eugene Meyer Jr. again.
From Lazard Frères, connected to the Rothschilds.
Right. The source notes his powerful roles War Finance Corporation under Wilson, then later on the Federal Reserve Board itself. And significantly, Meyer later bought up major assets like Allied Chemical and, crucially, the Washington Post.
Giving him media influence, too.
Exactly. The source even includes allegations of financial impropriety, like bond duplication schemes, helping Meyer build his fortune. It also makes highly controversial claims about the Dulles brothers.
John Foster and Alan Dulles.
Yes, from the powerful law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. The source links them to Schroeder bankers and makes the explosive allegation that they helped finance Hitler's rise in 1933, viewing World War II as a potential profit engine. Claims they were even at the meeting where Hitler became chancellor.
These are extremely serious allegations made in the source. And does it claim this kind of control structure continued right up to when the book was written?
It does. It asserts the same core group of families and banking interests stayed in charge. It cites a 1976 congressional study about interlocking directorates as evidence. Points out how Fed directors often came from a very small pool linked to these institutions.
Any later Fed chairs mentioned?
Yeah, it mentions Paul Volcker, linking him to Brown Brothers Harriman, part of that alleged London connection, and the Rockefellers via Chase Manhattan, and Alan Greenspan.
A very familiar name.
Very. Linked by the source to Rothschild interests through his association with Austrian economics and monetarism. The source even controversially suggests Greenspan's policies helped trigger the 1987 stock market crash.
The source branches out into some other really controversial areas, too, like the IRS. What's the claim there?
It's a pretty startling one. The source claims the Internal Revenue Service isn't really a government agency, but actually a private collection agency for the Federal Reserve System.
A private collection agency.
Yeah. It traces the IRS's conceptual origins back to medieval debt collectors. And it claims that legally, under Section 15 of the Federal Reserve Act, personal income taxes have to be deposited directly into the nearest Federal Reserve Bank.
Okay. That's definitely a fringe view. What about media control?
The source asserts there's a media monopoly, and guess who it claims controls it?
The same banking interests.
You got it.
Yeah.
It points to alleged interlocks board members sitting on bank boards and media company boards. Cites links between Brown Brothers Harriman, Eugene Meyer's Lazard Frères and the Washington Post, Kuhn Loeb and Wells Fargo, Morgan Guarantee and the New York Times, and other media giants.
And the purpose of this alleged control?
To promote certain agendas, according to the source. Things like higher taxes and attacking anyone who opposes what the source calls the program of the London connection. And just as importantly, suppressing information critical of this whole alleged power structure. It even compares the lack of independent newspapers in D.C. to other world capitals as supposed proof.
And there's one more really out there claim involving psychological influence, the Tavistock Institute.
Yeah, this one ventures into social engineering territory.
Yeah.
The source claims the Tavistock Institute in London started as a British Army psychological warfare unit.
Okay.
And its goal, allegedly, was to control American behavior. The source links Tavistock to the Rockefeller Foundation and also to S.G. Warburg & Co. through alleged involvement in developing LSD.
Wow. And what did Tavistock supposedly do?
The most extreme claim is that it used CIA funds supposedly funneled via James Paul Warburg's son, to actually stir up the campus riots in the U.S. during the 1960s.
Seriously?
That's the claim. And at the same time, it allegedly influenced supposedly conservative think tanks in America, essentially trying to manipulate the entire political discussion from behind the scenes.
Man, so the source weaves a narrative that goes from secret finance and economic crashes all the way to alleged control of taxes, media, and even psychological warfare operations aimed at the U.S. public. It's a lot.
It definitely connects a vast range of dots, tying them all back to this central thesis of hidden, primarily financial control.
Let's bring it back to the core criticisms that the source highlights from people who were there at the time, like Congressman Lindbergh or McFadden. What's the essential takeaway from their critiques, as presented in the book?
The source boils down their arguments. The Federal Reserve isn't really federal. It's privately owned. It doesn't have actual reserves in the way people might think. And it's not a coherent system for public good, but functions more like, and this is the source's provocative term from its FAQ section, a criminal syndicate.
Strong stuff.
Very. The fundamental charge is that it's private, it controls the nation's money and credit, often for foreign interests, and it was built for the profit and power of an elite few, not for stability or the benefit of the American people.
Congressman McFadden's words were particularly blunt, weren't they?
Extremely. The source quotes him saying the Fed banks are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States. It also mentions Carter Glass, who helped write the act, later supposedly regretting how it turned out, and H. Parker Willis, the first Fed board secretary, noting how local bankers allegedly used the system for cronyism, helping favorite sons and propping up failing banks.
So we've really journeyed through a very specific, very challenging account of the Federal Reserve, drawing entirely from this one source provided to us.
Absolutely. We've touched on the source's narrative of secret origins on Jekyll Island, the alleged behind-the-scenes manipulation of Congress, the structure supposedly dominated by New York and ultimately London.
Its alleged role in financing wars, engineering booms and busts, the claims about how money itself is created.
And then these wider, very controversial claims about the IRS, media control, even psychological operations via Tavistock. It's a comprehensive, if highly contentious, picture.
It definitely presents a version of history that challenges the standard narrative you might find in textbooks, suggests enormous power impacting the U.S. economy, maybe even society, operates outside of direct government oversight, affecting everything from big policy down to, well, the value of that dollar in your pocket. It's certainly a lot to think about.
It really is. And it brings us back to that warning highlighted in the source attributed to President Garfield via Alfred Crozier. Whoever controls the currency supply controls the business and activities of the people.
So if you entertain the claims made in this source, even just hypothetically about who allegedly controls that currency supply, what does that suggest about power, about independence in the U.S.? It leaves you with a pretty potent question to mull over, doesn't it? Who really controls the money, and what difference does that make to you?